The German Shepherd came through the blizzard like a ghost carrying the dead. Marcus Reed saw her first as a shadow against white chaos, a dark shape moving with impossible purpose through snow that had already buried his porch 3 feet deep. Then the wind shifted, and he saw what she carried in her jaws. A puppy so small and still it might have been a scrap of cloth, except for the way she held it, gentle as a prayer. Behind her, 8 more puppies emerged from the white wall of the storm, moving in a wavering line that looked less like animals and more like a funeral procession. And that's when Marcus's combat-trained eye caught it, the wrongness that made his chest tighten with old, familiar dread. The 3rd puppy moved with a stuttering gait, its back legs dragging slightly. The 5th one's breathing came in shallow, visible gasps that turned to mist in the frozen air. The smallest, at the rear of the line, had a skull that seemed too delicate, too misshaped, like something that should never have survived the birth. This wasn't a rescue arriving at his door. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. And truly, I am curious. Where in the world are you watching from? We love to see how far our stories travel. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's dive into today's story. Marcus Reed woke at 0530 hours every morning because discipline didn't care whether you had a reason to get up. The alarm was unnecessary. 3 years in these mountains had trained his body to surface from sleep at the exact moment dawn threatened the ridgeline, but he said it anyway. Routine was armor. Structure was survival. He moved through his cabin with the economy of motion that had once kept him alive in Kandahar. Check the wood stove. Temperature: 62 degrees. Acceptable. Inventory the water supply. 3 days reserve. Adequate. Survey the perimeter through frost-thick windows for tracks. Damage. Breach. All clear. The same sequence every morning, executed with the precision of a man who understood that the moment you stopped maintaining standards was the moment everything fell apart. The Navy had called him exemplary. 17 confirmed operations across 4 deployments. 2 Bronze Stars. A Silver Star he'd tried to refuse. The citation praised his tactical brilliance during the Kandahar extraction, how he'd made the impossible decision under fire, prioritizing mission success over sentiment, ensuring that at least one soldier made it home. What the citation didn't mention was Rodriguez's voice over the comm, steady even as the building collapsed around him. "Get out, Reed. That's an order." What it didn't mention was the sound of tapping on metal that got slower, quieter, until it merged with the ringing in Marcus's ears and became just another frequency of silence he'd carry forever. The team had called him ruthless in the best way, the kind of leader who'd calculate angles while bullets turned the air to geometry. They'd trusted him to make the hard calls. They'd believed he'd never leave them behind. They'd been wrong about that last part. After the memorial service, after watching 8 families bury their sons and husbands and fathers, after shaking hands with Rodriguez's widow who looked at him like he was a ghost wearing her husband's shame, Marcus had requested discharge. The Navy tried to keep him. Trauma counseling, they said. Survivor's guilt, they said. Give it time. But Marcus understood what they didn't. Some guilt wasn't something you survived. It was something you carried until it became heavier than your body, and then you found a place remote enough that when you finally stopped carrying it, no one else would be there to watch you collapse. He'd chosen Colorado because it promised exactly what he needed. Mountains that didn't care about medals, winter that killed without judgment, and enough distance from humanity that his failures couldn't metastasize into someone else's tragedy. The cabin had been a foreclosure, abandoned like everything else he touched. He'd bought it with cash and disappeared into it like a man stepping into his own grave. 3 years of perfected subtraction. 3 years of waking at 0530 to prove he could still maintain standards even if he'd lost every reason to maintain them. 3 years of checking perimeters against threats that never came because he'd eliminated the only real variable: himself. The blizzard warning had come through on his weather radio 2 days ago. Category 5 system, the meteorologist said with the kind of excitement civilians used for disasters they'd watch from safety. Marcus had inventoried supplies, reinforced the shutters, split extra wood. Prepared for 72 hours of whiteout conditions the way he'd once prepared for combat, with methodical precision and zero expectation of rescue. He hadn't prepared for the scratching at his door. The storm hit at 1,400 hours like an artillery barrage made of ice and rage. Marcus had seen blizzards before. Montana winters during SEAL training, high-altitude operations in the Hindu Kush, but this was different. This was the kind of weather that erased landscapes, turned familiar terrain into white chaos where up and down became suggestions rather than facts. He'd secured the cabin by 14:30. Double-checked the generator. Brought in enough wood to last a week if necessary. Then he'd settled into the practiced stillness of a man who'd learned to wait out worse things than weather. He heated coffee on the wood stove and watched through the window as the world disappeared behind walls of driving snow. The scratching started at 1,647 hours. At first, Marcus thought it was wind-driven debris, a branch, maybe, caught against the door. But debris didn't have rhythm. Debris didn't pause, then resume with that same deliberate, measured persistence. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound triggered something in his brainstem, some ancient alarm system that predated language. It was the sound of something that needed, something that refused to quit needing even when quitting was the only rational option. Marcus stood. Coffee forgotten. Every instinct screamed wrong. Animals didn't approach human dwellings during storms. They found shelter, conserved energy, accepted what nature demanded. They didn't scratch at doors with that kind of purposeful determination. He moved to the door. Through the frosted window, he could see nothing but white fury. The scratching continued. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Weaker now, but still refusing to stop. His hand found the deadbolt. Opening the door meant losing heat, creating variables, allowing the controlled environment he'd built to be compromised by forces he couldn't predict or contain. But his hand turned the bolt anyway. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and filling the cabin with snow that seemed to have consciousness and malice. He raised the flashlight and found her. The German shepherd stood on his porch like a monument to something Marcus had forgotten existed. Absolute, uncompromising determination. Her coat was thick with ice, her body trembling from cold or exhaustion or both. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. Dark, intelligent eyes that held none of the panic animals showed when cornered by nature's cruelty. Instead, they held something worse, expectation. She was looking at him like she'd known he would open the door, like his compliance was already factored into whatever impossible equation had brought her here. Clamped gently in her powerful jaws, protected by the curve of her body from the wind's worst fury, was a puppy. Marcus's field medical training kicked in automatically. The puppy was too small, maybe 3 weeks old, significantly underweight. Its breathing was shallow, rapid. But it was the shape of its head that made Marcus's chest tighten. Too narrow. Slightly asymmetrical. The kind of structural abnormality that meant something had gone wrong in development, something that would cascade through every system. The mother took one deliberate step forward. She didn't enter the cabin, didn't push past him to reach warmth. She simply stood there, the puppy held with impossible gentleness, and waited for him to understand what she was asking. Behind her, Marcus saw movement in the storm. His flashlight beam caught them, 8 more shapes emerging from the white wall, struggling through snow that should have killed them already. 8 more puppies moving in a wavering line toward his door. The mother's eyes never left his face. And in that moment, Marcus Reed understood that this wasn't a rescue. This was a reckoning. Marcus took the first puppy because refusing seemed impossible with those eyes watching him. He cradled the trembling body against his chest, barely 4 pounds of fragile heat and shallow breathing, and stepped back to let the mother inside. She didn't follow. Instead, she turned back into the storm, and Marcus understood with a sick certainty what was about to happen. She was going back for the others. He tried to stop her, called out against the wind, moved toward the door. But she was already gone, swallowed by white chaos, and Marcus was left holding a dying puppy in a cabin that suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a triage station he'd never asked to operate. The puppy's breathing was wrong. Too fast, too shallow, with a wheeze that spoke of structural problems in the respiratory system. Marcus laid it near the wood stove on a nest of towels, noting the asymmetrical skull, the slightly splayed front legs, the tremor in the hindquarters that suggested neurological involvement. His mind cataloged symptoms with the clinical detachment he'd learned in combat. Severe hypothermia, possible pneumonia, congenital abnormalities that would require intervention he wasn't equipped to provide. Any reasonable person would understand these were losing odds. The mother returned 23 minutes later with the second puppy. Then she left again. Over 4 brutal hours, Marcus watched her make 9 impossible journeys. Each time she emerged from the storm with another puppy clamped gently in her jaws, her body moving with the mechanical determination of something that had moved beyond exhaustion into pure will. Each time, Marcus took the puppy, dried it, assessed it, and felt the weight of old failures pressing against his chest like rubble. Because every single puppy was compromised. The second had a cleft palate. He could see it when the puppy struggled to breathe, the incomplete fusion of tissue that would make nursing nearly impossible. The third moved with that stuttering gait he'd noticed in the storm, back legs dragging from what looked like spinal or hip dysplasia. The fourth was so underweight it felt like holding a skeleton wrapped in fur. By the 5th puppy, Marcus had stopped hoping for normalcy. This one had seizures, small tremors that rippled through its tiny body every few minutes, the kind of neurological misfiring that spoke of oxygen deprivation during birth or genetic damage too deep to fix. The 6th had breathing so labored Marcus could hear fluid in the lungs from 3 feet away. The 7th puppy's eyes wouldn't open properly. Possible microphthalmia, underdeveloped organs that might never function. The 8th had a heart murmur so pronounced Marcus could feel it through the puppy's fragile ribcage, the arrhythmic flutter of a valve that had formed wrong and would fail eventually, maybe soon. The 9th and smallest puppy arrived last, and Marcus knew immediately this one wouldn't survive the night. Its skull was misshapen, body too cold, breathing too irregular. This was the puppy nature would have claimed first, the one any wild animal would have abandoned to save the stronger siblings. But the mother had carried it last, which meant she'd left it vulnerable longer, risked it dying while she saved the others. She'd brought it anyway. Marcus laid all 9 puppies in a row near the wood stove and looked at the mother, who stood watching him with those uncompromising eyes. Her body was shaking from exhaustion and cold, ice crusted in her fur, but she made no move toward warmth or rest. She was waiting for him to choose, accept the mathematics of loss, or fight for what any reasonable person would have already abandoned. The smallest puppy convulsed in Marcus's hands at 0300 hours, and suddenly he was back in Kandahar with Rodriguez screaming over the radio. Marcus depressed the plunger on the feeding tube, watching formula disappear down the tiny throat, but his mind was splitting in two. Half here in the fluorescent glare of the clinic, half in that compound with the whole weapons cache cooking off around them. "Come on, little one," he murmured, but he was really saying move, move, move to Rodriguez, to Alvarez, to Jackson. The puppy's siblings had already grown cold on the warming pad. 2 down. Just like the math had been simple that night. 3 men pinned, 1 extraction bird, a landing zone too hot to touch. The mother dog whined from her kennel, pressed against the bars, desperate to reach her babies. Marcus had sedated her lightly. For her own good, he'd told himself, but she was fighting it, fighting him, refusing to accept what he already knew. The weakest puppy wouldn't make it. Neither would the others. Sometimes you had to let go. We can't leave them. Rodriguez had shouted, and Marcus had made the call. Had ordered the bird down anyway because Rodriguez wouldn't leave. None of them would. They were a team. 28 seconds later, the RPG hit. Marcus's hands stilled on the feeding tube. The puppy's breathing had grown shallow, that terrible rattle he recognized from too many trauma bays, too many impossible triage decisions. He pulled the tube and began chest compressions with 2 fingers, counting mechanically, but he knew. He'd known since the moment someone brought this litter in from behind the Afghan restaurant on Riverside. The universe had a sick sense of humor. The mother dog had tried to climb out twice already, scratching his arms bloody to get to the weakest one. The one the others pushed away from warmth. The one she refused to abandon even when Marcus tried to explain, in the ridiculous way he talked to animals now, that sometimes survival meant choosing who lived. But she wouldn't choose. She'd fight for all of them until the end. That was the difference between them. The puppy went still in his hands. Marcus sat back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 3 hours fighting for this one. 6 hours total. And now the mother dog was howling, a sound of pure loss that split him open, and he was moving without thinking, opening the kennel door. She lunged past him to the table, nosing her dead babies with increasing desperation, pushing at the smallest one, the fighter, trying to wake it. She curled around all 3 bodies and lowered her head, and Marcus found himself sliding down the cabinet to the floor. She had stayed. She had refused to leave the weakest one behind. She had done what he couldn't. The overhead lights buzzed. Outside, dawn was coming, and Marcus understood finally that Rodriguez had made his own choice that night, had chosen to stay together. All of them. To the end. The mother dog raised her head and looked at him with exhausted, knowing eyes. Then she licked his fingers once, gently, and Marcus, after 2 years of silence, finally began to cry. Dawn came gray and cold. The storm finally exhausted into silence. Marcus had been awake for 27 hours straight, monitoring breathing, adjusting heat sources, tube feeding the puppies too weak to nurse. The mother had finally collapsed near the wood stove around 0400, her body giving out the moment she'd confirmed all 9 were inside and warm. She slept now with one ear raised, that eternal vigilance even exhaustion couldn't override. Marcus stepped outside into knee-deep snow and followed the mother's trail backward. It wasn't difficult. She'd carved a path through the drifts like a highway of desperation, and he could see where she'd rested, where she'd struggled, where she'd stopped to catch her breath before pushing forward again. The den was nearly 2 miles south, tucked into a riverside cave system that had probably seemed safe before the storm. Now it was a tomb. The entrance was half collapsed, flooded with ice-choked water from the swollen creek. Inside, Marcus found the evidence. Torn earth where something had dug, coyote scat near the entrance, and blood frozen into the stone. She'd been attacked while the puppies were too young to flee, and the storm had turned her sanctuary into a death trap. 2 miles. 9 trips. In a blizzard that had buried his porch 3 feet deep. Marcus stood in the ruined den and felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw after years of permafrost. He returned to find Grace Whitman's truck in his driveway, which should have been impossible given the roads. Grace was 63, iron-haired, and had been bringing him supplies every few months despite his clear preference for isolation. She'd never taken his silence personally, just left food on his porch and drove away. Now she stood in his cabin, staring at 9 puppies and 1 exhausted German shepherd, and her face held something between wonder and horror. "Marcus Reed," she said quietly, "what have you done?" I opened the door. Grace moved closer, her rancher's eye assessing what Marcus already knew. She pulled out her phone, and Marcus started to object. He deliberately kept his cabin off-grid, unreachable, but she cut him off. "Lena Park owes me favors. She's got a veterinary clinic in Boulder Ridge." Grace's voice held no room for argument. "She'll come." Dr. Park arrived 3 hours later in a jeep that should have been illegal for civilian use, carrying equipment Marcus recognized from field hospitals. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 35, with steady hands and eyes that had clearly seen loss before. She examined each puppy with methodical precision while Marcus and Grace watched in silence. Finally, she looked up. "3 of them won't make it," Dr. Park said, her voice clinical but not unkind. "The one with the heart murmur, that valve is too compromised. The smallest one has neurological damage that's incompatible with survival. And the one with microphthalmia also has kidney abnormalities I can feel on palpation." She paused. "The others might survive with intensive intervention, but I need to ask, is fighting for them kindness, or are we just prolonging suffering?" The mother dog raised her head from the floor, those dark eyes finding Marcus across the room. "That's not a medical question," Marcus said quietly. "That's a philosophical one." "Then what's your philosophy, Mr. Reed?" Dr. Park asked. "When the odds say let go, what makes holding on anything more than selfishness?" Marcus looked at the puppies. All 9 of them broken, all 9 of them breathing. He thought about Rodriguez under rubble, about leaving versus staying, about the mathematics of survival versus the refusal to accept that mathematics always wins. "I don't know," he admitted. "But she made 9 trips to bring them here. That has to mean something." Dr. Park's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she inserted the subcutaneous line, but her eyes told Marcus everything he needed to know. "Severe hypoglycemia, dehydration, possible sepsis," she said quietly. "Even with intervention, Marcus, the odds are—" "I know the odds." His voice was steady. He'd been living with impossible odds for 2 years. She handed him the feeding tube kit and a chart for hourly vitals. Every 2 hours for the tube feeding. If his temperature drops below 98 or his breathing becomes labored. "I'll call you immediately." Marcus was already cradling the puppy against his chest, feeling the tiny ribcage expand and contract like a whisper. So small. Smaller than his cupped palm. He'd carried heavier magazines in Kandahar. Chance. He'd named him silently while Dr. Park worked, this scrap of fur that refused to quit even as his body failed him. Because everyone deserved a name. Rodriguez had taught him that, insisting they learn the names of every local who helped them, every translator, every kid who warned them about IEDs. Names mattered. Names meant you were real. Grace stood in the doorway of the exam room, her arms crossed but her expression soft. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I can help with the night feedings." "I've got it." Marcus was already calculating intervals. 0200, 0400, 0600. His body remembered these rhythms, the way time broke into segments during patrol rotations. He could do this. He had to do this. But Grace didn't leave. She pulled up a chair beside him as he settled onto the floor, his back against the cabinet, Chance bundled in a heating pad across his lap. "Then I'll sit with you," she said simply. The hours bled together. Marcus worked with the same focused intensity he'd once applied to field medicine, checking respirations per minute, palpating the tiny abdomen for distension, monitoring the barely there pulse with 2 fingers against Chance's femoral artery. Every 2 hours he threaded the feeding tube down the fragile throat, depressing the plunger with surgical precision while counting milliliters under his breath. Grace brought him coffee at midnight. Made him eat a sandwich at 0300. Didn't ask questions when his hands trembled while drawing up the formula, or when he had to stop and breathe through the flashbacks that hit him at 0430. The smell of the clinic mixing with cordite, Chance's labored breathing becoming Rodriguez's final gasps. "You're good at this," Grace said softly during the 0600 feeding. Dawn was breaking outside, painting the exam room in shades of gold. Marcus looked down at Chance. The puppy's eyes were still sealed shut, but he was fighting. His tiny paws pushed against Marcus's palm with surprising strength during the feeding, his body instinctively struggling for life even when his systems were shutting down. "I used to be good at keeping people alive," Marcus said. The words came out raw. "Before I made the call that killed 3 of them." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Or maybe you made the call that honored 3 men who refused to leave anyone behind." Marcus's throat tightened. He watched Chance's chest rise and fall, each breath a small victory against impossible odds. The puppy was still here, still fighting. And Marcus realized, for the first time since Kandahar, that he was fighting too. Not running, not hiding. Actually here, present, alive in a way he hadn't been in years. Even knowing he would probably lose. Especially knowing he would probably lose. "Come on, Chance," he whispered. "Stay with me." The lights died at 1847 hours. One moment Marcus was checking Chance's temperature. 99.2, finally climbing into normal range, and the next the clinic plunged into darkness as wind hammered the building like incoming artillery. Emergency backup failed to kick in. Marcus's hands found the flashlight in his pocket on pure muscle memory. The same flashlight he'd carried downrange. The beam caught Chance's tiny body on the heating pad, which was already cooling without power. Then Chance stopped breathing. No. Marcus scooped the puppy up, feeling for a heartbeat against his palm. There. Faint. Irregular. Failing. No, no, no. Not now. You were getting better. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands. No signal. The storm had taken the cell tower. Dr. Park was 40 minutes away in good weather. Impossible to reach now with roads icing over and communications down. Grace had left an hour ago to check on her own animals before the storm hit. Marcus was alone. Chance's body went limp. The heartbeat stuttered. Stopped. Marcus's training took over. 2-finger chest compressions, 30 per cycle, but Chance was so small, smaller than any patient he'd ever worked on. Too much pressure would crush ribs like toothpicks. Not enough, and it was useless. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and tried rescue breathing, covering the tiny nose and mouth with his lips, breathing softer than a whisper. Nothing. The mother dog was suddenly there, pressing against Marcus's leg. She'd been sleeping in the recovery kennel but now stood vigil beside him, whining low in her throat. Her eyes caught the flashlight beam. Dark, knowing, waiting. "I don't know what I'm doing," Marcus said, his voice breaking. His hands kept working mechanically. Compress. Breathe. Compress. Breathe. "I don't know if I'm helping or hurting him. I don't." But his hands knew. His hands remembered every combat casualty, every impossible save, every time he'd refused to call time of death until someone physically pulled him away. Rodriguez had called him stubborn. Alvarez had called him crazy. Jackson had just called him Doc and trusted him completely. Marcus repositioned his fingers. Felt for the heart through skin like tissue paper. Compressed with the barest pressure. Counting. Breathing. Refusing to stop. The clinic creaked around him. Wind screaming through gaps in the walls. Temperature dropping by the minute. Sweat ran down his spine despite the cold. The mother dog pressed closer, her warmth against his side. "You don't give up on them," Marcus whispered to her, to himself, to the ghosts that followed him everywhere. "You don't get to choose who deserves to live. You just fight. You fight for all of them until there's nothing left." His arms burned. His fingers cramped. He lost count of the cycles. 20, 30, 40 compressions. Chance's body remained limp and cold. But Marcus didn't stop. He thought about Rodriguez refusing to leave, about the mother dog refusing to abandon the weakest puppy, about every impossible choice that came down to one simple truth. You stay. You fight. You refuse to surrender. Not because you'll win, but because surrender isn't an option when someone's life is in your hands. Under his fingers, something fluttered. Faint. Barely there. Marcus held his breath. Felt again. There, a heartbeat. Weak but present. Chance's tiny chest expanded on its own. Once. Twice. The puppy gasped, coughed, and began breathing in shallow, desperate pulls. Marcus collapsed back against the cabinet, cradling Chance against his chest. The mother dog licked his face once, then settled beside him, her body warm against his leg. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, in the circle of flashlight beam, 3 survivors breathed together in the dark. "Okay," Marcus whispered. "Okay. We're okay." Marcus buried the 3 puppies under the oak tree behind the clinic on the first warm day of March. Dr. Park had offered to handle it. Protocol, she'd said gently. But Marcus had shaken his head. He needed to do this. Needed to stand in the soft dirt with a shovel in his hands and say the words he'd never gotten to say over Rodriguez, Alvarez, and Jackson. "You fought hard," he told the small bundle wrapped in soft fleece. "You mattered. I won't forget you." Valor pressed against his leg, warm and solid. She'd recovered fully, her coat glossy now, her eyes bright. She watched as Marcus filled in the earth, then sat beside the small grave while he carved 3 names into a flat river stone. Not the puppies' names. He'd never named the ones who didn't make it, couldn't bear to. But Rodriguez, Alvarez, Jackson, the names he'd carried silently for 2 years. He placed the stone at the base of the oak tree and finally let them rest. Inside the clinic, chaos reigned. 6 puppies, impossibly, miraculously 6, tumbled over each other in the expanded whelping box Grace had built. Chance was smallest but fiercest, a scrappy ball of fur who'd claimed Marcus's boot as his personal territory. The others were thriving under the careful rotation of volunteers Grace had organized. Elderly Mrs. Chen, who sang to them in Mandarin, teenage Kyle from down the road who was applying to vet school, Pastor Williams who'd shown up one day and simply asked, "What do you need?" "I need them to find good homes," Marcus had said, and meant it. He couldn't keep 6 puppies. Could barely keep himself together most days. But Dr. Park had smiled, exchanging a look with Grace that Marcus didn't quite understand. "Already handled," she'd said. "I've got a list of specialized adoptions, therapy dog programs, service animal training, family placements we've thoroughly vetted. Everyone wants one of Valor's puppies. The ones who survived the winter storm." The story had spread somehow. Marcus suspected Grace. The community had adopted the puppies as their own miracle, bringing supplies, checking in, treating Marcus less like the broken veteran who'd moved to town and more like someone who belonged. It was terrifying. Grace found him one afternoon sitting on the clinic floor, Chance asleep in his lap, Valor's head resting on his knee. The other puppies were napping in a puppy pile that looked like it defied physics. "You did it," she said softly, settling beside him. "I lost 3. His voice was rough. "You saved 6. And yourself." She gestured around the clinic, at the photos volunteers had tacked up, the schedule board covered in names, the coffee maker someone had donated. "Look what you built here, Marcus. This isn't isolation. It's community." Marcus looked at Chance, whose tiny paw was wrapped around his thumb even in sleep. Looked at Valor, whose steadfast presence had become as necessary as breathing. Looked at the life that had somehow grown around him while he wasn't paying attention, while he was too busy fighting to save something, anything, to notice he was being saved in return. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to let people in. How to trust that I won't." He couldn't finish. Grace's hand found his shoulder. "One day at a time, Marcus. Same way you saved these puppies. One feeding. One breath. One choice to keep going." Outside, snow was melting. Inside, 6 puppies dreamed and Valor kept watch, and Marcus, broken, healing, trying, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, spring was finally coming. Marcus stood on the porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching Chance climb into the van. The dog turned once, tail wagging before the handler. A young woman with kind eyes and steady hands closed the door. Certified therapy dog. Official vest. Real purpose. Marcus had spent a year teaching Chance to be still, to read faces, to offer comfort without overwhelming. Yesterday, he'd signed the papers releasing him to work with wounded veterans at Walter Reed. The van disappeared down the mountain road, and Marcus felt something unexpected. Pride without the weight of grief beneath it. Grace's voice came from behind him. "You know he'll be brilliant." She'd become something like a friend over the months, the kind who showed up with groceries when the roads were bad, who understood when Marcus needed silence instead of conversation. She'd helped with the other puppies too. The ones who'd survived that terrible night had each found their way to purpose. Mercy was a diabetic alert dog in Oregon. Scout worked with a child who had seizures. Hope provided emotional support to a family still recovering from loss. Each broken puppy had become something essential. "Dr. Park called again," Grace said, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. "She's serious about the position." The rescue organization needed someone who understood damaged things, who had patience for the long work of healing. Marcus had said he'd think about it. He'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. "I'd have to leave the cabin sometimes," he said. "Yes. Go to meetings. Work with people." "Terrible," Grace said, but she was smiling. Valor pressed against his leg, warm and solid. The dog was older now, moving a little slower, but his eyes still held that impossible knowing. Marcus knelt, running his hands through familiar fur, and realized the truth he'd been circling for months. The cabin had never been an ending. It was always meant to be a beginning. He'd come here to hide, to wait out some unnamed sentence he'd imposed on himself. Permission to stop hurting. Permission to feel whole again. Permission to live. But healing didn't arrive like a verdict or a presidential pardon. It accumulated in small moments. Puppies learning to trust, coffee shared on quiet mornings, the decision to try again when trying seemed impossible. "Tell Dr. Park yes," Marcus said. Grace nodded, understanding in the simple gesture that this meant something. Snow began to fall, soft and steady, covering the ground where Valor had once appeared with his impossible burden. Marcus watched it accumulate, thinking about Chance settling into his new work, about puppies who'd found purpose in their brokenness, about a man who'd finally stopped waiting for permission to be alive. He was already living. The snow fell, and Marcus went inside to make the call.